in the thick gold dust of a Nevada town. In 1876, a gunshot tore through the general store. Plaster rained down like white snow, coating the flour sacks and the faces that had stopped breathing. A man stood in the middle of the crowd, rifle trembling in his hands, eyes bloodshot, locked on the ledgers spread across the counter. No one understood why he raised a gun in broad daylight, among neighbors he had known for years. The black numbers on the paper still lay there, cold and undeniable. A woman's silhouette stepped forward from the dry goods shelf. Both hands locked around a heavy bolt of canvas. She swung hard. $3. That was everything. Sue Quan counted it twice in her palm before she stepped down off the freight wagon into Copper Creek, Nevada. Because counting it a third time wouldn't change the number. It would only make her hands shake worse. Summer of 1876. Dust thick as smoke in the air. A town built out of raw pine and worse intentions, or so it looked from where she stood. She hadn't meant to end up here. She had meant to end up somewhere with a roof that didn't leak. Somewhere with a name that didn't make shopkeepers go quiet the second she said it. Somewhere Wen would have liked, maybe, except Wen wasn't choosing anything anymore. Wen was 6 weeks in the ground outside Reno. A blasting crew. A hillside cut too close to the rail line. A mistake somebody made with dynamite and never had to answer for. She hadn't seen it happen. That was the strange mercy of it, if you could call it mercy at all. She'd been 3 miles off, boiling water for the wash, when the sound came rolling across the flats like thunder that never bothered climbing into a sky first. She remembered setting the kettle down, remembered not knowing why her hands had gone cold before anyone came running to tell her, because some part of her already knew. Some part of a wife always knows, before the words arrived to make it official. They'd let her see him. Once. Under a sheet that didn't quite cover everything it should have. She hadn't cried then. That came later, alone, in a room she was renting by the week in Reno, 3 days after the funeral, when she opened his trunk to fold his shirts away and found, instead, a letter he'd never sent. Half a page of his careful, patient handwriting, asking the company politely, so politely it made her chest ache to read it, when his back pay might be settled. He'd never gotten an answer, because he'd never mailed the question. The foreman had told her, not unkindly, that a widow's claim on a dead man's wages was a matter for the company office. He'd said it the way men say things they've said before to other widows, worn smooth at the edges from repetition. She didn't have fare to San Francisco. She barely had fare to here. So here she was. A town she'd chosen, mostly because the wagon driver taking freight out of Reno had a route that passed through it, and because stopping cost her nothing, and going further cost money she didn't have. That was the whole of her plan. Not ambific. Main Street choked with wagons, freighters hollering over grain prices, a blacksmith's hammer ringing out steady under a tin awning, like the whole town had one heartbeat, and that was it. Dust rose gold and slow under every wheel that passed, under every hoof, and hung there like it wasn't in any hurry to settle either. Sue walked the boardwalk with her carpet bag gripped in both hands, reading signs. General store, land office, a boarding house with a card in the window, no vacancy. A woman inside was watching her through the glass with an expression that said the vacancy wouldn't have been for her regardless, card or no card. She tried the dry goods store first, because she could sew a straight seam faster than most women twice her size, and the man behind the counter had flour on his and looked like he needed help badly enough not to care who gave it. He heard her out, arms crossed the whole time. Positions filled, he said this morning, which was a lie. She knew it was a lie the way you know weather is turning before the first drop falls. Something in the air of it, something in how fast he said it. She didn't argue. Arguing cost more than it bought. The boarding house next. She offered to cook, to glean, anything, in trade for a room. The landlady said they were full up. Twice that week Suyin passed that same window. Twice she saw the card still turned to the glass. No vacancy. Funny how a sign could lie so plainly and nobody called it out. The bakery after that. A woman with flour-dusted forearms and a kind enough face who looked at Suyin's carpet bag and her travel-worn dress and said gently that she couldn't afford to hire anyone right now. Except there was a hand-lettered notice in the window, not 3 feet behind her. Help wanted, ask within. Suyin didn't point it out. There wasn't any use in it, the laundry then. Because if there was one trade in the West that ought to have welcomed a Chinese woman's hands, It was that one, except the man who ran it eyed her, like she'd come to steal his business out from under him, rather than beg a place in it, and told her, flatly, that he already had all the help he needed. The milliner's shop. The seamstress 2 doors down, who might have hired her on skill alone if skill alone had ever been the question. It wasn't. It never was. Not in this town. Not for a woman who looked like she did, and spoke with the accent she carried. However faint it had become after 6 years married to an American man on American soil. By the 6th door, she stopped expecting anything different behind the 7th. She was standing outside the assay office by then, carpetbag heavy as a stone, arm aching from carrying it, throat tight from swallowing the same polite thank you, anyway, over and over, until the words had lost whatever shape they'd started with, wondering if there was a single business left in Copper Creek that hadn't already decided her answer before she'd opened her mouth. She thought, standing there, of something Wen used to say. Not everyone who shuts a door is your enemy, Su Yin. Some of them are just tired. Except she was beginning to suspect he'd been wrong about that, or maybe just kind about it, the way he was kind about most things that deserved less kindness than he gave them. She set the carpetbag down, just for a moment, flexed her fingers, and told herself, was silently, sternly, that she would try one more door before she'd let herself sit down on the boardwalk and cry in front of strangers, because that particular humiliation was the one thing left she still had the power to refuse. She let her mind drift, just for a moment, to the last good year, because sometimes that was the only trick that worked, when the present got too heavy to carry standing up. She'd met Wen at a rail camp outside Sacramento, 3 years into her time in this country, when she was still learning which American customs deserved trusting and which deserved a careful distance. He'd been the only man in that camp who ever bothered asking her opinion on anything before offering his own. Small thing. It hadn't felt small at the time. It still didn't. He proposed to her with a ring made from a bent length of copper wire, because a real ring cost money neither of them had, and he'd been so embarrassed handing it to her that he'd nearly dropped it in the dirt trying to get down on one knee. She still had it, sewn into the lining of the carpetbag sitting at her feet right now, because it wasn't worth stealing and she couldn't bear to leave it behind in a trunk she'd had to sell for train fare. 6 years married. Long enough to learn the rhythm of a good marriage, not the loud, dramatic kind you heard about in songs, but the quiet, steady kind, built out of 10,000 small mornings where he made the coffee too strong and she pretended not to notice, and 10,000 small evenings where she read him the numbers from whatever ledger she was keeping that season, and he pretended to understand more of it than he did, just to watch her explain it, because he told her once, the way her whole face lit up when she was right about something. He'd have hated Copper Creek's shut doors, would have marched up to every single one of them and argued, politely, relentlessly, until somebody caved out of sheer exhaustion. That had been his gift, not force. Persistence dressed up as patience. She didn't have that gift. Not the same way he did. What she had instead was a spine that didn't bend, even when it wanted to, and a mind for numbers that had never once failed her, even on days everything else had. It would have to be enough. It was at the moment all she had left. She picked the carpetbag back up, because that was the thing. Nobody warned you about grief. It wasn't the crying. She'd done plenty of that already, alone, in a rented bed in Reno, until there wasn't anything left to cry with. It was this. Standing on a strange boardwalk in a town that had already made up its mind about you. Being a problem people walked around instead of a person they looked at. She was still standing there when the horse came down the street at an easy trot, a big dark gelding, a white sock on one foreleg, and the man riding it sat the animal, like it was a piece of him, not something separate he was steering. He reined up outside the feed store, not 10 feet from where she stood, swung down in one motion, easy, like his body had done it 10,000 times and never once thought about it. Tall, sun-browned, dressed like every other rancher she'd passed all week. Except he looked at her the way almost nobody else in this town had bothered to. Straight on, like she was a person standing on a boardwalk. Not a problem he needed to walk around. Ma'am. He touched the brim of his hat. She said nothing, because 6 refusals had taught her that speaking first usually cost her something. You look like a woman who's been asking around town, he said, and not getting anywhere. Is it that obvious? You've got the walk of someone who's been turned down times before lunch. 6, she said, and didn't soften it. I stopped counting the polite ones. Only the ones that bothered giving a reason. He tied the horse off at the rail, unhurried about it. Nathaniel Hargrove.
Folks call me Nate.
He held out a hand. She looked at it a second too long before she took it, because a hand held out was a rare enough thing this week that she'd half forgotten what to do with one. His grip was careful, like a man used to being stronger than whatever he was shaking hands with, and choosing the glum every time not to prove it. I run a spread about 4 miles east of here, he said. Hargrove, cattle. If anyone in town's mentioned it, they haven't mentioned much of anything to me. He was quiet a beat, studying her the way she imagined he studied a horse he was thinking about buying, which she found, strangely, she didn't mind, because at least he was thinking about it, not simply saying no and moving on. You looking for work, he said, or looking for a way out of Copper Creek? Work. I've got nowhere else that wants me badly enough to buy the ticket. Silence again. Longer this time. I'm not hiring, he said. Her chest went tight, because 6 refusals hadn't prepared her for a 7th. Not delivered so plainly. Not by a man who'd strange minute, like he might be different. She turned, started to walk. I'm asking, he said before she'd gotten 2 steps. There's a difference. She stopped. I've got 400 head, he said. A foreman who can't keep books straight to save his life. A bunkhouse full of men who won't touch a needle and thread if their shirts fall clean off their backs. I need someone who can read a ledger, mend a seam, and not faint at the sight of a branding iron. That's not charity work you're describing. It's not charity I'm offering. Flat. No heat in it. Like a fact about weather. It's a job I can't do without. And so far nobody in this town's been fool enough to want it. Why not? Because I pay a widow the same wage I'd pay a man. He said it like it cost him nothing to say and everything to mean. And Copper Creek doesn't much care for that arithmetic. She thought of the $3 in her purse. She thought of the boarding house with no vacancy for her. Twice. And the 6 shut doors. And this one open hand standing in front of her now, like it might close again if she waited too long to take it. You interested, he said. Or have I wasted both our afternoons? Yes. She said it before she'd entirely decided to, which frightened her a little. Because she never did things before deciding. Wen used to tease her about that. Measure twice, cut, and never, if you can help it, he'd say, and she'd swat him with a dish towel, and he'd laugh like he'd won something. She didn't let herself think about that laugh right now. There wasn't room for it. Not standing in the middle of a street with a stranger's job offer, still hanging in the air between them. Because what if she said yes, and it turned out to be nothing? Another door that looked open and slammed shut the second she stepped through it. What if there was no ranch at all? No 400 head. No ledger, only a man with a kind face and worse intentions. And she was fool enough, tired enough, desperate enough to climb into a wagon with a stranger, because he'd looked at her like a person for exactly 90 seconds. She studied him again. The steadiness in how he stood. The way his eyes hadn't once dropped from her face to anywhere they had no business going. 6 years married to Wen had taught her plenty about reading a man in under a minute. Not everything. Enough. I'll want the wage in writing, she said. Before I climb onto anything. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one, maybe, that hadn't decided yet whether it was allowed. Fair, he said. I'd think less of you if you didn't ask, and I sleep in the house. Not the bunkhouse. There's a room off the kitchen. Was my aunt's before she passed. Door locks from the inside. He said it plain, no offense taken, like a man who'd expected the question and respected it for being asked. You'll have it to yourself. She nodded once. Filed it away. The way she filed away every small honest answer. Because honest answers were currency out here, and she intended to keep count of every one he gave her. Then I'm interested, she said again, formally this time, like signing something. He whistled once, short, toward the feed store, and a boy came jogging out, leading a second horse and a battered wagon behind it, already half loaded with sacks of grain. Otis'll drive you out, Nate said. I've got business to finish in town first. Won't be an hour behind you. You're sending me off alone with a man I've never met. Otis wouldn't harm a fly, he didn't have to swat twice. Nate's mouth did the almost smile thing again. And you strike me as a woman who could handle herself regardless. You don't know that about me. No, he admitted. But I've got a feeling, and my feelings about people don't miss often. She wanted to ask him how many times they had missed, and about what, and whether one of those times had a wife's name attached to it. She didn't ask. There would be time for that later, if there was going to be a later at all. The ride out took the better part of an hour. Suyin sat the wagon seat beside a ranch hand named Otis Kane, who talked more to the mules than to her, which suited her fine. He was a narrow, sun-cured man of maybe 50, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some accident he didn't offer to explain, and she didn't ask about, and the only thing he said to her, directly the whole ride, was, "Hold on through the wash, it's rutted bad." About 20 minutes in, right before the wagon dropped hard into a dry creek bed and nearly sent her carpet bag over the side, she held on. He grunted something that might have been approval. The land unrolled slow around them. Sage flats going gold-gray in the afternoon light. Distant hills the color of a bruise just starting to fade. Nate rode ahead on the gelding, a dark shape cutting through the heat, and Suyin found herself watching the line of his shoulders more than the scenery, which she decided, firmly, was simply because there was nothing else worth watching out here. She didn't believe herself, not entirely, but she let it stand. By the time the house came into view, low long, a porch running its whole front, a windmill turning lazy beside a stock tank, smoke rising thin from a cookhouse chimney off to one side, she understood 2 things plainly. First, this wasn't a small operation, whatever his plain talk had suggested. There were corrals enough for 200 horses, a barn near as big as the house itself, a bunkhouse with its own porch and its own woodpile, split and stacked with more care than most men gave their own front steps. Second, every man in the yard stopped what he was doing to watch her climb down off that wagon, and none of them looked pleased about it. A dozen faces, maybe more, turning her way in a silence that wasn't really silence at all, just talk that had decided to wait until she was out of earshot. The foreman met them at the porch steps before Nate had both boots on the ground. Silas Crane, thick through the neck, thicker through the middle, hat pushed back on a head of hair going gray at the temples in a way that might have looked distinguished on a different sort of man. Mouth already working before anyone had said a word to him. "Boss." A nod at Nate. Then his eyes swung to Suyin and stayed there a beat too long, cataloging her, the way a man might size up a mule he suspected had been sold to him lame. "This the help you rode into town for?" "This is the help," Nate said. "Mrs. Kwan. She's going to sort out the books you've been butchering since, and she'll take over the mending on top of it." Something flickered across Silas's face, gone almost as fast as it arrived. If she hadn't spent 6 years reading numbers for a living, hadn't spent 6 years learning to catch the smallest tell in a column that didn't want to be caught, she might have missed it entirely. She didn't miss it. "Men won't like a woman going through the accounts," Silas said. "Men don't have to like it." Nate's voice didn't rise, but something in it closed the subject like a door swinging shut on its own weight. "I do the hiring on this ranch, Silas. Same as I always have. Show her the office. Somebody get her trunk off that wagon before Otis decides it's easier to leave it in the yard." "It ain't a trunk," Otis said mildly from the wagon seat. "It's a carpet bag." "Get the carpet bag then." Silas didn't argue further, though the look he gave Suyin on his way past, quick, assessing, gone before Nate could catch, it wasn't one she planned to forget any time soon. She'd seen that look before, on the rail line, in the eyes of foremen counting a dead man's widow as a problem solved by simple absence. In the eyes of men who'd decided, long before she opened her mouth, exactly what a Chinese woman traveling alone was worth to them, and exactly how little trouble it would take to be rid of her. It had never once meant anything good. The office off the main house was cramped and close with heat, one window facing west, so the afternoon sun came in low and stubborn, and as Silas led her toward it, he paused at the threshold just long enough to say, not quite under his breath, "Books have been fine long as I've kept them. Whatever you find in there, you bring to me first." "Not the boss, me. Mr. Hargrove hired me," she said. "I answer to him." Silas's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "We'll see how long that lasts." He left her there. Dust motes turning slow in the light from the window, ledgers stacked crooked on a shelf like nobody had touched them with any real intention in months, and Suyin stood a moment in the doorway, carpet bag still in hand, feeling the whole weight of the afternoon settle onto her shoulders at once. She set the bag down, rolled her sleeves, and got to work, because work, whatever else it was, had never once failed to hold her upright when everything else in her life had given way beneath her. Her room that first night was smaller than she'd expected, given the size of everything else on this ranch. A narrow bed, a washstand, A single window facing east, so the morning would come in gentle instead of glaring. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like it had been closed up a long while before anyone thought to open it for her. She sat on the edge of the bed, listened to the house around her footsteps somewhere overhead, the low murmur of Nate's voice through a wall, though she couldn't make out the words, a door closing somewhere far off. Sounds of a house that had people in it. She hadn't lived in a house with people in it, not really, not since Reno. She unpacked slowly, not because there was much to unpack: a few dresses, a sewing kit, the carpet bag's other contents fitting easily into the room's single narrow dresser, but because the act of it, of setting her own small belongings into a space that might, for a while, actually be hers, felt like something she wanted to do carefully, deliberately, like proof of something. She found the copper ring at the bottom of the bag, sewn into the lining where she'd left it, and sat with it a long moment before putting it away again, unworn, into the dresser's top drawer, beside the folded letter. Because some things you carried close, and some things you simply carried, and that was enough. She blew out the candle, lay in the dark listening to a house full of strangers settle into sleep around her, and thought, before she drifted off herself, that this was the first door in 6 weeks that hadn't shut in her face. She intended to hold on to it, whatever it cost her to do so. He came to the office door the following morning before she'd even lit the lamp, a single sheet of paper in his hand, ink still faintly damp at the edges. "You asked for it in writing," Nate said, setting it on the desk in front of her. "Here it is." She read it slowly. Wage, hours, terms, all of it laid out plain, no vague language a man could later claim to have meant differently. At the bottom, his signature, careful and blocky, the handwriting of someone who wrote with his hands more often than his pen. "This is more than you offered on the street. Did the arithmetic again last night." He shrugged, like it cost him nothing to admit it, though something in his posture suggested otherwise. Figured a woman, doing the work of a foreman and a seamstress, both ought to be paid like it. Didn't seem honest offering less. Most men would call that bad business. "Most men," he said, "haven't sat across a ledger from someone who found 6 months of a foreman's lies inside a week of looking. I'd call underpaying you the worst business long term." He tipped his hat, half a formal gesture, half something closer to teasing. "Sign it if the terms suit you. Don't if they don't." "I won't think less of you either way." She signed it. Watched him fold the paper and tuck it inside his coat pocket, the same pocket she noticed met where he'd tucked her own notes about the feed contracts days before, as though he was quietly collecting every piece of proof that mattered to him in the same place, close to his chest, where nobody could take it from him without a fight. "Mrs. Kwan," he said, pausing at the door, "for what it's worth, I meant what I said on the boardwalk. This isn't charity. It's the smartest hire I've made in years, and I intend to treat it like one." He left before she could find an answer worth giving back. She sat a while with the signed copy of her own terms in front of her, the ink drying slow in the morning light, and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might, given enough honest mornings like this one, grow into it. The office was a cramped room off the main house. Ledgers stacked crooked on a shelf that hadn't been dusted since before her husband died, let alone since March. Dust hung thick in the light from one window. Somewhere past the corral, a dog barked twice and gave up on whatever it was barking at. She sat down that first evening with a small lamp and began working through 6 months of Silas Crane's arithmetic. The heat hadn't broken by sundown. She worked with her sleeves pinned back, a cloth at her wrist to keep sweat from smearing the ink, and the lamp drew moths against the glass in slow, stubborn circles that never seemed to end anywhere. Column after column. Feed. Tack. Wages. The small cash outlays that kept a working ranch fed and shod, and none of it added up the way 6 years of her husband's own bookkeeping had taught her honest numbers should. Because here was the thing about mistakes. Real ones, careless ones, they scattered a little short here, a little long there. Buckshot, spread thin, no direction to it. These numbers a shape instead, they leaned. One direction only. Every error fattening the same set of entries. And a woman who had spent 6 years balancing a rail worker's pay against a rail worker's debts knew the difference between a clumsy hand and a guided one. Her pulse picked up a little. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling of finding a loose thread on a seam that's supposed to be finished. You don't want to pull it, except you always do. She went back further: February, January, December of the year before, because a pattern that only showed up for 1 month was an accident. A pattern that showed up for 6 was a habit, and habits belong to people, not to chance. It was there in December too. Smaller. Easy to miss, if you weren't already looking for it: a feed order, marked delivered on a day the supplier's own posted schedule, which she'd noticed nailed up outside the feed store in town, said no deliveries ran that week at all. She checked it twice, 3 times. The kind of checking that wasn't about doubting herself anymore so much as making sure the truth couldn't wriggle free later and call itself a misunderstanding. It didn't wriggle free. It sat there on the page, patient and unashamed, the way only a well-practiced lie can afford to sit. She thought of when, briefly, the way he used to run his thumb down a column of freight costs and say, "Numbers don't lie, Suyin. But people surely do, and they hide behind numbers to do it." She hadn't understood at the time why that struck her as sad rather than simply true. She understood it better now, sitting in a dead man's borrowed office with a stranger's ledgers spread in front of her like a confession. Nobody had meant to write down. By the time the lamp burned low, she'd filled 4 pages of her own careful notes. Some errors careless. Some she was almost sure not careless at all. She stared at the last column a long while before blowing out the lamp. Because this wasn't her business. She was hired to balance a ledger, not to accuse a man of anything. Except the numbers weren't asking her permission to mean what they meant. They never did. That was the thing about numbers that people never seemed to understand until it was too late to unknow it. They didn't care who got hurt by what they revealed. They only cared about being true. She lay awake a long while in the narrow bed off the kitchen, listening to the house settle, to some animal moving through brush far off in the dark, and thought about Silas Crane's parting words at the office door. "Whatever you find in there, you bring to me first." Not the boss, me, a man who says that isn't protecting a ledger. He's protecting himself. She decided, in the dark and staring at a ceiling she couldn't see, that she would bring her findings to Nate and no one else. Whatever it cost her. She brought the notes to Nate the next morning. Found him at the corral fence watching 2 hands work and a young horse that didn't want to be worked. He read her notes in silence, jaw setting tighter with every line. When he reached the 3rd page, he went still. So still, the horse in the corral tossed its head, like it had felt the change in him before she'd seen it herself. These 3 entries. He tapped the page. Feed purchases. Same supplier, same month. Twice the going rate. I checked the supplier's prices against 2 other ranches' accounts posted at the feed store. She kept her voice level. Someone is either buying feed badly, or buying it well and pocketing the difference. Silas handles all the feed contracts. He said it slow, like a man working out the shape of something he didn't want to see clearly. Even though she suspected, some part of him had seen it for longer than he wanted to admit. "I'm not accusing anyone," she said. "The numbers are." He folded the pages, put them inside his coat. "Keep this between us for now, and keep doing exactly what you're doing." The days took on a shape of their own. Mornings in the office with the ledgers. Afternoons mending shirts and harness leather in the shade of the bunkhouse porch, where the ranch hands mostly ignored her, which she'd learned a long time ago to prefer over the alternative. On the 3rd afternoon, a young hand named Cole, barely 20, all elbows and blushing, dropped a shirt in her lap without quite meeting her eye and mumbled something about a sleeve that had come apart at the shoulder seam. She turned it over. The seam hadn't come apart. It had been cut, deliberately, messed with a knife, sloppy enough that she almost laughed. "You did this yourself," she said. "Just now. So you'd have a reason to talk to me." His ears went the color of a branding iron. "No, ma'am. There's a knife mark here. Straight as a ruler. Cloth doesn't tear that clean on its own." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He just took the shirt back, mumbled something about needing it by supper, and fled toward the barn at a pace that suggested the conversation had cost him more courage than facing down a stampede would have. She mended it anyway. Set the stitches small, and even the way Wen used to tease her for doing even on work shirts, nobody would ever look twice at. "Waste of good thread on a man's field clothes," he'd say, and she'd tell him a crooked seam unravels twice as fast, so it isn't waste. It's arithmetic. And he'd laugh and kiss the top of her head and let her win. Because he always let her win an argument about numbers, knowing full well she was right, and he simply liked hearing her defend it. She folded the mended shirt and set it aside and, For one unguarded moment, let herself miss him so plainly it nearly knocked the breath out of her sitting there in the shade. Then she picked up the next shirt in the pile and went back to work. Because grief, she'd learned, didn't ask permission to arrive, and it didn't much care if you were in the middle of something when it did. You simply let it pass through and kept your hands moving. Nate checked on her work most evenings. Standing in the office doorway, hat in hand, asking sharp questions about numbers most men in Copper Creek wouldn't have thought a woman capable of answering, and listening to her answers like they mattered. Really listening. Not the kind of listening men did while already deciding what they were going to say next. One evening he brought her a cup of coffee, black and too strong, and stood there a moment working up to something, before he finally said, "You take your tea a particular way. I noticed this morning. You noticed how I take my tea." "I notice things," he said, a little defensive, like she'd accused him of something. "It's half of running 400 head without losing your shirt. You notice, or you go broke." "And what did you notice?" "Sugar. Barely steeped. Like you don't trust it to be sweet." He set the coffee down in front of her, apparently realizing halfway through the gesture that it was the wrong drink entirely for the observation he'd just made, and looked, for one unguarded second, thoroughly annoyed with himself. "This is coffee." "I don't know why I brought you coffee." "Because you were nervous," she said, watching him over the rim of the cup, and nervous men reach for whatever's closest. "I am not nervous. You brought a woman who doesn't drink coffee a cup of coffee, Mr. Hargrove." "It's Nate," he said, which wasn't an answer to anything, which was, in its own roundabout way, exactly the answer she'd been fishing for. He cleared his throat, recovered some of his composure, and added, gruffly, "Drink it, or don't. I've got horses to see to." He left before she could tease him further. She drank the coffee anyway. Too strong, too bitter, and she found, somewhat to her own irritation, that she didn't mind it nearly as much as she should have. Nobody had listened to her like that in a long time. She caught herself thinking about it more than she meant to, which annoyed her, because she hadn't come to Copper Creek to think about a rancher's eyes, or the careful way he held a teacup like it might break if he wasn't paying attention. Or, stop. She made herself stop. There was mending to do, there were ledgers to balance, there wasn't room in her life right now for anything shaped like wanting. Except, on the 6th day, a heifer got loose from the branding pen, came through the yard at a dead run, panicked, heavy enough to break a leg, or worse if it struck anyone standing in its path. Suyin was crossing from the spring house with an armload of linens when she heard the shouting, turned to find 800 pounds of animal bearing down on her, with nowhere to run that would clear it in time. There wasn't time to think. There was only time to do. She flung the linens wide, shouted. A sudden flare of white cloth that spooked the heifer sideways, just enough, and it thundered past her shoulder instead of through it. Close enough she felt the heat off its flank. Nate reached her at a dead run, breathing hard, hands checking her over before he seemed to remember himself and stopped. "You didn't move." There wasn't time to move. Her heart still slamming against her ribs. There was only time to think of something faster than running. It worked. That's all that matters. It worked because you didn't panic. He said it like the observation cost him something to make out loud. Most people freeze solid in front of a stampeding animal. You found a way to turn it aside instead. "I've had practice," she said, standing still while large, dangerous things bear down on me, deciding what to do about it. She meant it lightly. It landed heavier than she intended. He didn't ask her to explain which large, dangerous things she meant. He only nodded, like he understood well enough, without her saying it plain, and helped her gather the trampled linens up out of the dirt, both of them quiet, the yard going gold and still around them, like it was holding its breath too. Across the corral she noticed Silas Crane had stopped what he was doing to watch the whole thing unfold, not with concern, with something closer to calculation, like a man recounting a hand of cards he thought he'd already won. She filed that away too. That night, after the linens had been washed and hung, and the last of the day's heat had finally started to loosen its grip on the yard, Nate found her sitting on the porch steps instead of in the office, ledgers for once left untouched inside. "You're not working," he said. "Not quite a question. Even arithmetic needs to breathe some evenings." He sat down beside her. Not too close. Close enough that she was aware of the space between them, the way you're aware of a held breath. For a while neither of them said anything at all, and the quiet wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her more than she wanted to admit. "This ranch," she said eventually. "How long has it been yours?" "Built it up from nothing with my father. He died the winter before I married." He turned his hat over once in his hands, a habit she was starting to recognize as the shape his thinking took when it turned towards something difficult. 400 head now. Started with 60 in a stretch of land nobody else wanted, because everybody figured the water table out here was too unreliable to bother with. And was it? Took some finding, took some stubbornness, a faint, tired smile. "My wife used to say I was better suited to arguing with land than with people." "Land doesn't talk back near as much. Does it argue back at all?" "Every single day," he said. "That's the part nobody tells you before you buy it. The land's got opinions. You just have to learn its language before it'll share them with you." She thought of her own 6 years of ledger's numbers that argued back too, in their own quiet, patient way, if you knew how to listen. She didn't say that out loud. Some things you kept, the way you kept a hairpin in a tin, or a letter folded soft at its creases, because saying them made them smaller somehow, and she wasn't ready yet to make this one smaller. "You're good at your work," he said, after another stretch of quiet. "Better than good. I've had men keep these books for me who couldn't find a mistake if it bit them. You hired me on a hunch, outside an assay office. Best hunch I've had in years." He said it plainly, no flourish to it, and stood before either of them could decide what to do with the weight of that sentence sitting between them. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Kwan. Ledgers'll still be there come morning. They generally are." He left her on the steps with the last of the daylight fading gold behind the western ridge, and it was a long while before she went inside. It was 2 evenings later that she learned the rest of it. She'd stayed late at the desk, chasing one last discrepancy through 8 months of feed receipts. The bunkhouse lamps had gone dark an hour before, her own candle burning low, wax pooling at the base of the holder. Nate came to the doorway, not to check her figures this time, just to stand there, hat in hand, in a way that told her the visit wasn't about the ranch at all. "You asked me once why I hired a widow nobody else in town would touch." He leaned against the frame. "I never gave you the honest answer. You said you needed someone who could read a ledger. That's true." A pause. "It's also not the whole truth." He turned his hat over once in his hands. "My wife died 4 years back. Fever. The kind that moves through a house in a week and leaves nothing behind to fight." His voice didn't break exactly. It just went somewhere flatter, somewhere further away. "Everyone in Copper Creek came to the funeral, told me how sorry they were, and then every one of them started treating me like a man who needed managing, instead of a man who needed work to do. Nobody offered you a job. Nobody had to." He met her eyes. "But I know what it looks like. When a whole town decides it already knows everything about you before you've said a word. That isn't the same as what happened to me. No, quiet. Yours is worse, and I know it. I'm not fool enough to think a dead wife and a dead husband and a foreign face carry the same weight in this town's eyes." He held her gaze. "But I recognize something in the way you were standing outside that assay office, like a person who's had every door shut in her face and is still deciding whether to knock on one more." She didn't have an answer for that. Not one she trusted her voice to carry steadily. So she said nothing at first. Instead, she reached into the desk drawer, drew out the one thing she'd carried the whole way from Reno that wasn't strictly useful, a folded square of paper. Gone soft at the creases from months of handling, she set it on the desk between them without quite deciding to. "My husband's last letter to the company office, asking after his back pay before the accident." She smoothed the fold flat with 2 fingers. "He never sent it. I found it in his coat after." "What does it say?" "It only holds him," she said. "That's all." A man asking politely for money he'd already earned, from people who never intended to give it to him, whether he lived or died. Nate looked at the letter, didn't touch it, which she understood somehow as its own kind of respect. "I don't have anything of hers left in a drawer," he said. "Burned most of her things after the fever. Doctor's word, said it wasn't safe to keep them." A long pause. "I kept one hairpin. Silver. Nothing special. It's in a tin on my dresser. Couldn't tell you why I kept that one thing over anything else. Except a man needs to keep something, or the losing of a person starts to feel like it never happened at all." "That's exactly it," she said, folding the letter back along its worn crease. "Something to prove it happened. Something to prove they were real." He didn't have an answer for that either. Not right away. For a moment they simply sat with the lamp burning low between them. 2 people who'd each buried someone. who'd each kept one small, useless, necessary thing to remember them by. The next morning, she found herself back in the receipts. Because there was a discrepancy from 4 years past, she hadn't looked at closely an old ledger. One she'd pulled off the shelf mostly out of habit, dust thick along its spine, its leather cover cracked at the corner from being handled roughly, and then, it seemed, mostly forgotten. 4 years passed. The number sat wrong in her mind, even understood why. She sat with it a moment, turned it over, the way you turn over a stone in a creek bed, looking for whatever's hiding underneath. She turned the pages slow. April, May, the month the fever would have come through, if she'd counted right from what he'd told her. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch going on, about its business, a hammer somewhere, a horse blowing air through its nose, Otis Kane's low, steady voice talking to a mule that never talked back, and it struck her. She just looked at him, and how strange it was that grief this old could still be sitting here, folded into a column of numbers, waiting patiently for somebody to finally notice it. A line item. Medicine, doctor's fees. She traced it with one finger. A supplier's name she didn't recognize, Whitcomb and Sons. The hand read 3, though the letters wobbled slightly, as if whoever wrote them had been in a hurry or hadn't wanted to write them at all. Twice in the same week. Once through the household account, a modest sum, the sort a rancher might reasonably spend trying to save a dying wife. And once buried 3 pages later, easy to miss if you weren't looking hard, tucked under a column marked miscellaneous stock, the sort of vague heading a careless bookkeeper used when he didn't want a careful one, asking questions through the ranch account. Same supplier, same week. Same almost to the dollar. Her hands went still on the page. She checked the household ledger again, then the ranch ledger, laying them side by side under the lamp so she could compare the 2 entries line for line, the way she used to compare Wen's pay stubs, the company's own posted rates, hunting for the gap between what a man was owed and what a man was given. There it was, plain as anything once you knew to look. $22, spent twice, that could only have been bought once. Because if this was what it looked like, if someone had billed the ranch for medicine meant to save a dying woman, pocketed the difference while that woman was still fighting for breath in the house, above this very office she sat back, the candle guttering, wax running down its side in a long, slow tear that pooled and hardened at the base of the holder. She thought of Nate's voice on the porch step, low and worn at the edges. My wife died 4 years back, fever. The kind that moves through a house in a week and leaves nothing behind to fight. She thought of him saying everyone in Cop Creek came to the funeral, told me how sorry they were. Somebody in this house had been robbing him blind while his wife lay dying upstairs, breath by failing breath, and had stood at that same funeral afterward, hat in hand, offering condolences with the same mouth that had signed a false receipt not 3 weeks before. Somebody had let a man bury his wife not knowing that the money meant to save her had been quietly split in 2, and that he'd been made pay to put her dying twice over without ever once being told. She didn't know yet, for certain, whose hand had written that second entry. The ink was too faded, the writing too rushed, to say with the kind of certainty she'd want before she carried this to anyone. But the shape of it matched every other error she'd already found on this ranch. With the same leaning hand, the same guided carelessness, dressed up to look like an accident, and hoping nobody would ever look closely enough to see it wasn't. She didn't sleep that night, turning the ledger page over and over in her mind, the way she'd once turned over her husband's unsent letter, looking for a version of the truth that didn't hurt as much as the one sitting in front of her. Because there was a difference, she understood this now, lying awake, in the dark, listening to the house settle around her between exposing a man for skimming feed money, which was theft, plain and ugly and worth punishing on its own account, and exposing a man for having done it while another man's wife was dying, which wasn't just theft anymore. It was something closer to cruelty wearing theft's clothes. She decided, finally, near dawn, gray light just starting to crawl in under the window shade, that she wouldn't bring this one to him yet. Not until she was certain beyond any argument a guilty man might try to make, because some wounds you don't reopen on a guess. You reopen them once with proof in your hand so solid nobody can talk their way out from under it. Or you don't reopen them at all. She closed the old ledger, set it apart from the others on its own, at the back corner of the shelf where her eye would find it again, without anyone else's eye finding it first. And she went to wash her face in the basin, because the sun was coming up whether she'd slept or not, and there was mending waiting, and a ranch to keep running, and a secret now sitting in her chest with a weight she hadn't asked for and couldn't yet put down. On the 10th day, Silas found her alone in the office. Nate had ridden out at dawn to check a fence line on the far side of the property. Wouldn't be back before supper, and Silas seemed to know that better than she did, because he came in without knocking, filling the doorway with his shoulders, and shut the door behind him with a care that unsettled her more than slamming it would have. "You've been thorough," he said. No greeting first. "More thorough than I expected. I do the work I'm paid to do." That old ledger. He nodded toward the shelf, toward the corner where she'd set it apart from the others. Her stomach dropped quick and cold before she caught herself and kept her face still. "The one from 4 years back. You've been in it. I've been in all of them. That's the job." "Some pages," Silas said, stepping closer, "are better left unread. Not because there's anything to hide, because some things a man's better off not knowing about his own house. You understand me? I understand that you're standing very close to my desk, Mr. Crane, telling me which parts of my work I'm allowed to do." Something in his jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might reach for the ledger himself, and she found her hand had already moved, without her quite deciding it should, to rest flat on the desk between them, not on the book, just near it, a small unmistakable line drawn in the dust. "I've run this ranch's business for 6 years," he said, "long before you rode in with your sad story and your quick hands. Boss trusts me. Whatever you think you've found in some old column of numbers, you'd do well to remember whose word carries weight around here and whose doesn't." "Numbers don't care whose word carries weight," she said. Steady, though. Her pulse was hammering. "They only care about being true." He studied her a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, the same look she'd caught across the corral the day of the heifer. Then he smiled, thin and humorless, and said, "We'll see how true they look once winter comes. The boss needs a foreman he trusts more than a bookkeeper he barely knows." He left without another word, the door clicking shut soft behind him, somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. She sat very still for a long while after he'd gone, hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, and thought, "What he knows. He doesn't know how much I know. But he knows I'm close to something, and a cornered man is a dangerous kind of animal, whatever kind of man he was before you cornered him." She thought of the 4 years of receipts he'd rather she hadn't found, sat behind that heavy door, and wondered, was not for the first time, whether unraveling this one was going to cost her more than she had left to spend. She found Otis Kane an hour later, out by the tack shed, oiling a saddle with the slow, methodical care of a man who'd rather be doing something with his hands than sitting still with his own thoughts. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept working the leather, the rag moving in small, even circles. "Saw Silas go in there," he said. "Not a question. Saw him come out looking like a man who'd swallowed something he didn't care for the taste of. He had opinions about my work. Silas has opinions about most things that ain't his to have opinions on." Otis set the rag down, looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived on the ranch, his weathered face unreadable in the way of men who'd learned young to keep their thoughts to themselves. "Been here 9 years, longer than Silas. Long enough to remember when the boss's daddy ran this place, and long enough to know Silas Crane's gotten comfortable thinking nobody's ever going to look too close at what he does with the money. You've noticed something. I don't read numbers, ma'am. Never learned. But I've got eyes, and I've watched wagons come out here from the feed store carrying less than what the boss paid for, more times than I care to count." He picked the rag back up, resumed working the leather, like the conversation had already cost him more than he'd meant to spend. "Wasn't my place to say nothing. Wasn't sure anybody'd believe a ranch hand over a foreman anyhow." "I'll believe you." He studied her a moment longer. Something in his face loosened, just slightly, not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow into it, given time. "You watch yourself around him," Otis said. "Man's been getting away with something for years. Man who's been getting away with something for years don't take kindly to somebody threatening to stop him. I intend to be careful. See that you are." He nodded once, a small formal gesture, and turned back to his saddle. "Boss thinks well of you. More than he's let on, probably. Be a shame if Silas Crane's greed cost this ranch more than money." She left him to his work, the words sitting heavy in her chest, alongside everything else she was already carrying, and made her way back toward the house with the distinct uncomfortable feeling of a woman walking deeper into a room she couldn't yet see the far walls of. It was on the 11th day that the trouble she'd half expected finally arrived. She was walking back from the spring house with a bucket of water when three of the hands blocked the path in front of her, not by accident. The oldest of them, a lean man named Hank Dodd, who worked closest under Silas, spat into the dirt near her boots. "Heard you've been going through the books," he said, "looking for men to blame. I go through the books because Mr. Hargrove asked me to. My daddy fought Chinamen on the railroad crews for 4 years." Hank stepped closer, close enough she could smell the whiskey on him, though it wasn't yet noon. "Said your kind smiles at a man's face. Cheats him blind soon as his back's turned. I haven't cheated anyone." Her voice stayed level, though her grip on the bucket handle had gone white-knuckled, the water inside trembling with the effort of holding still. "I've found where the cheating already was." The two men behind Hank shifted their weight, half a step closer, the kind of movement that isn't quite a threat yet but wants you to feel that it could become one at any moment. Because that was how it always started. Not with a blow. With a closing circle. With men who wanted you to understand, before anything happened, exactly how alone you were. "Careful," one of the others muttered, younger, uncertain, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be standing here at all. "Boss finds out." "Boss ain't here," Hank said. "Boss is out checking fence 4 miles off. Won't be back till supper." Plenty of time for a woman to trip and spill her water and learn her place before anybody's the wiser. Suyen's mind went very cold and very clear, the way it had the moment the heifer came thundering toward her. Not panic. Something past panic, into a kind of stillness that let her think even while her heart hammered. "You'll want to consider," she said, "what Mr. Hargrove will do to a man who lays a hand on someone under his roof. Consider it carefully before you decide whether whiskey courage is worth 6 years of wages." "Awful lot of nerve," Hank said, "for someone about to get exactly what her kind's always had coming." He stepped closer again. Close enough now that she thought for one long moment he meant to knock the bucket from her hands. Or worse. And there was nobody in the yard to see it happen, nobody but the two men flanking him, who wouldn't lift a finger to stop it, and the wide empty stretch of dust between here and the house, too far to call for help and be heard before whatever was about to happen, happened. She set her feet, because if this was going to happen, she wasn't going to be caught flinching when it did. That was when the sound of hooves came fast around the corner of the barn. The dark gelding cut between her and the three men so close that Hank had to jump back or be run down. Nate was off the horse before it had fully stopped, and whatever was on his face made all three hands find something urgent to attend to elsewhere. "Hank, quiet," which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "You've got something to say to me. Say it to my face." Instead of cornering a woman by the spring house when you think nobody's watching, wasn't cornering nobody. We was just talking. "I've been writing this section 15 minutes. Nate's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone hard as flint. "Watched you block her path from the ridge line. Watched your two friends here close up behind her so she couldn't step around. That's not talking, Hank. I know what talking looks like." His hand hadn't moved toward the pistol at his hip, but Hank's eyes kept flicking to it anyway, like he expected it to move on its own if he waited long enough. "Her kind's been robbing ranchers blind since the first rail crew came through," Hank said, and some of the whiskey courage still holding, though his voice had thinned considerably since the hoofbeats arrived. Your daddy isn't signing your pay," Nate said. "I am, and I don't pay men to repeat their daddy's grudges on my land against someone working under my roof while I'm not here to see it done proper." One of the younger hands, the one who'd muttered careful a moment before, took a full step back, putting distance between himself and whatever was about to happen next. Hank didn't move. Just stood there, jaw working, caught somewhere between backing down and doubling down, the stubborn kind that gets men hurt when they'd be smarter just walking away. "You want to work for a man who pays fair wages and asks fair questions," Nate said. "You keep your hands and your mouth to yourself around anyone on this payroll. That includes Mrs. Kwan every single time. Not just when I happen to be riding by. You don't like the arrangement, Silas can settle your account today, right now, and you can find work somewhere that suits your daddy's opinions better than mine ever will." The silence stretched. Long enough that even the horse seemed to be waiting on it. "I ain't looking to lose my wage over a bookkeeper," Hank finally muttered. "Then you know what to do." Hank backed off, muttering something under his breath that Suyin didn't catch and didn't ask him to repeat, though from the set of his shoulders as he walked away, she suspected it wasn't an apology. The yard emptied fast after that. The two other hands peeled off toward the barn, without a backward glance, eager, seats seemed to be anywhere else. And within a minute, the whole stretch of dust between the spring house and the house stood empty again, as though nothing at all had happened there. Nate turned to her. For the first time since the boardwalk in town, something in his face wasn't entirely steady. "You're not hurt?" "No." Her hands were shaking regardless. She willed them still and mostly failed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." He took the bucket from her hands. An unnecessary gesture. She let him make it anyway. It shouldn't have happened at all. On my land. Under my nose. They started back toward the house together, slower than the errand required. Evening starting to cool the way it did, once the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Cicadas grinding steady in the grass. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, a harmonica working through the same 4 bars nobody could quite name. "You could send me back to town," she said. After a silence stretched long enough, she felt she had to fill it with something. "No trouble with Silas, or Hank, or anyone else who doesn't care for the arithmetic. I could." He didn't slow his walk to consider it, which told her more than a long pause would have. "I could also let a man skim my ranch blind, because chasing him off would ruffle a few feathers. And I've never run this place by making the easy choice when the honest one was sitting right there in front of me." He glanced at her sideways. "You want to go back to town?" "No." The word came out plainer than she meant it. She didn't take it back. "There's nothing in Copper Creek for me but shut doors." "Then you'll stay," he said. Something in the flatness of it, the same flatness he'd used the day he told her he wasn't hiring, told her the matter was settled, as far as he was concerned. Simple as that. She looked toward the barn, where Silas's shadow had disappeared a minute, before Hank had blocked her path. Timing that seemed less like coincidence the longer she turned it over in her mind. "You cannot prove that from a spilled bucket and a drunk man's mouth," she said. "No." His jaw tightened. "But I can prove it from a ledger, given time. And you're the one who's been finding the proof." She thought about the 4-year-old page still sitting open on her desk. The medicine, the doubled billing, the wife who died upstairs while somebody downstairs was quietly getting rich off it. She thought about how she still hadn't told him. Not yet. Because there was a difference between a man's greed and a man's cruelty, and she wasn't certain yet which one she was about to hand him. And once she did, there'd be no folding that particular letter back along its crease and putting it away in a drawer. Some things, once said, you can't unsay. She looked at him in the last of the light, dust hanging gold in the air between them, same as it had the day she'd stepped off that wagon with $3 in her purse and nowhere left to go. 6 doors shut in her face, and this one still standing open. "There's something else," she said finally, "in the old ledgers. I need one more day to be certain before I bring it to you." He studied her, the way he'd studied her that very first afternoon on the boardwalk, like a man deciding whether a thing in front of him was worth the trouble of wanting. "Whatever it is," he said, "I'd rather hear it from you than find it myself and wonder how long you knew." "You will," she said. "I promise you that." And she meant it. Even though some part of her, the part that had already buried one man's letter in a drawer and carried it 1,000 miles rather than let it go, understood that promises like this one had a way of costing more than you bargained for when you made them. They walked the rest of the way in silence. A comfortable one, mostly, except for the small hard knot sitting low in her chest, the one that hadn't loosened since she'd found that second receipt buried 3 pages deep in a ledger nobody was supposed to still be reading. Because there was a version of tomorrow where she told him everything, and he thanked her, and Silas Crane was gone from this ranch before the week was out. And there was another version, one she couldn't quite stop herself from picturing, where the truth cost more than either of them had bargained for, where proving a man's greed also meant reopening a wound that had only just, after 4 long years, started to close over. She didn't know yet which version was waiting for her. She only knew there wasn't any way forward that didn't run straight through it. The lamp in the office window was still burning when they reached the porch, small and steady against the dark coming down over the yard, over the corral, over a ranch that hadn't yet learned how much its own numbers were about to cost it. "Get some rest," Nate said. "Whatever it is you found, it'll keep till morning." "Will it?" she said. Not quite a question. Something in his face shifted a flicker of worry he didn't quite manage to hide before he caught it, and smoothed it back down. "That bad? I don't know yet. I'll know by morning. He nodded slowly. Didn't press her further, though she could see it cost him something not to. Then morning it is. She climbed the steps ahead of him. Didn't look back to see if he was watching her go. She already knew he was. Behind them, unnoticed by either, a shape detached itself from the shadow beside the barn and stood a long moment in the near dark, watching the office window, watching the lamp that hadn't gone out, before turning and walking off toward the bunkhouse with the slow, unhurried gait of a man who had already decided what he intended to do about it. Su-yin didn't see him. Not that night. Word of what had happened at the springhouse moved through the bunkhouse before supper was even served, the way word always did on a ranch this size, carried hand to hand faster than any letter could travel. By the time the men sat down to eat, every one of them knew that Hank Dodd had crossed a line, and that the boss had drawn it back sharp enough to leave a mark. Most of them, she noticed over the following days, treated her a little differently after that. Not warmly, not yet. Trust wasn't a thing that turned over in a single afternoon, not for a woman who looked like she did in a town like this one, but carefully, respectfully, in the quiet way men showed respect when they weren't quite sure yet whether they'd earned the right to call it friendship. Silas Crane was not among them. He watched the whole business unfold from the barn doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing to anyone, and when Nate passed, close enough to speak to him directly, a short, clipped instruction about the morning's branding schedule, Silas answered with the easy, agreeable tone of a man who had absolutely nothing to hide, and everything, underneath that tone, still very much to lose. That night, long after the lamps in the bunkhouse had gone dark, he sat alone at the small table in his own quarters, with a bottle he hadn't opened yet, turning a folded scrap of paper over and over between his fingers. An old receipt, one he'd been meaning for longer than he wanted to admit, to burn. He hadn't burned it. Some part of him, greed, or carelessness, or simple arrogance, built up over 6 comfortable years of nobody looking too closely, had let it sit, tucked away, telling himself there'd be time enough to deal with it later, if it ever became a problem. It had become a problem faster than he'd planned for. He thought about the widow's careful hands moving through his ledgers, page by page, patient as water finding the low ground in a field, and understood, moved with the particular clarity that comes to a man. Only once he's already lost the advantage of getting ahead of something, that patience like that didn't stop on its own. It would have to be stopped, one way or another. He set the receipt down, reached, finally, for the bottle, instead, and told himself, the way men in trouble always tell themselves, that he still had time to decide exactly how. Up at the main house, the lamp in Suyin Kwan's window had long since gone dark, and she slept for the first night in 6 weeks, without dreaming of shut doors, not knowing yet how soon, and how badly, that quiet would be broken. 2 weeks passed. Quiet ones, mostly. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace so much as a held breath. Suyin worked the ledgers every morning now, with the old one, the one from 4 years back, kept apart, at the corner of the shelf, like something that might still bite if she wasn't careful reaching past it. She hadn't told Nate. Not yet, because a wound that old deserved more than a guess laid across it. It deserved certainty. Certain she was learning, took its own sweet time arriving. So she waited. Cross-checked. Found 2 more entries in the years between, small ones, easy to miss, that matched the pattern of the first. A man who steals once rarely stops at once. That much her husband's own careful bookkeeping had taught her, long before she ever set foot in Nevada, except waiting had a cost too. She just didn't know yet how steep. Hank Dodd hadn't left the ranch in the end. Silas had talked him into staying quietly, the day after Nate's warning, some private conversation in the barn that Suyin only heard about secondhand, from Otis, who'd caught the tail end of it and hadn't liked the shape of what he'd overheard. Hank kept his distance after that. Wide, deliberate distance, the kind a man keeps when he's been told plainly to behave, rather than the kind a man keeps because he actually changed his mind about anything. She noticed him watching her sometimes, across the yard, expression unreadable. She told herself it was nothing. She didn't quite believe herself, because there's an unease that settles into you once you've a place isn't as safe as it first appeared, and no amount of daylight, no amount of Nate's protection, ever fully talks it back down again. You just learn to carry it alongside everything else. One more weight added to a load that was already, some days, almost more than she could manage. She kept working anyway, because the alternative, stopping, retreating, letting fear decide what she was and wasn't allowed to investigate, wasn't a version of herself she was willing to become. Not after everything it had already cost her to get this far. Nate started finding reasons to be near the office that had nothing to do with the ledgers. A saddle needing mending that could have waited a week. A question about supper that any of the hands could have answered faster. He'd lean in the doorway, hat in hand, and ask about numbers he already half understood, just to watch her explain them. And she'd caught herself, more than once, drawing the explanation out longer than it needed to be, because she liked watching him listen, which was a foolish thing to like. She reminded herself of that nightly, told herself, sternly, lying in the narrow bed off the kitchen, that she hadn't come to Copper Creek to fall for a rancher's careful hands and quieter kindness, except telling herself that hadn't stopped it from happening anyway. Grief, it turned out, didn't leave much room to argue with the heart, once the heart had already made up its mind. One evening he brought her a slice of pie instead of coffee. Got the drink right this time, at least the currants. Black tea, barely steeped, no sugar. Progress. You remembered. Told you. I noticed things. You noticed a woman's tea preferences after one cup. I noticed everything about that first week, he said. Quieter than he meant to, maybe because something crossed his face right after a flicker of surprise at his own honesty, quickly covered by reaching for his hat like it needed adjusting. Ledgers included. She didn't have an answer for that. She ate the pie instead, and let the silence between them do the talking neither of them was quite ready to do out loud. Another evening, he asked her to teach him the column system she used, the one that let her catch a lie 3 pages before it fully revealed itself. He sat beside her at the desk, sleeves rolled, and got it wrong twice before he got it right, and laughed, actually laughed. A full unguarded sound she hadn't heard from him before, when she pointed out gently that his 7s looked exactly like his 1s, and no honest ledger could survive that kind of confusion. My wife used to say the same thing, he said, still smiling, though something quieter moved underneath it now. About my handwriting. Did she teach you better? Tried for years. Never quite took. He looked at the page a moment. Then at her. You've got more patience for it than she did, I think. Or maybe I'm just more willing to learn now than I was then. She didn't ask him what had changed. She thought she already knew, and asking out loud felt like reaching for something not quite ready yet to be named. Try the 7 again, she said instead. Cross it this time. Otherwise it's just a badly drawn one wearing a hat. He laughed again. Crossed the 7, got it right. They worked another hour past, when either of them needed to, the lamp burning low, the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into night around them, and Suyin thought, didn't, watching him bend careful over a column of numbers that mattered to him more now than they had a month ago, that this was the first evening, in longer than she could easily count, where grief hadn't been the loudest thing in the room. It was Silas who broke the quiet first. 3 days later, $40 went missing from the strongbox in the office. Cash meant for a supplier's payment, counted and recounted the evening before, sitting exactly where it should have been. Gone by morning. Suyin found the empty space in the box before anyone told her to look, because she'd counted that money herself twice. The night prior old habit, born of 6 years managing a household on a rail worker's wage, where every dollar had to answer for itself before it was spent. Her stomach dropped, cold and immediate, the moment her fingers found the box's velvet lining instead of the folded bills that should have been sitting there. She checked twice more. Checked the drawer beneath it, the shelf above, the floor around the desk, some frantic part of her mind insisting there had to be a simple explanation, a misplacement. Anything other than what the empty box was so plainly telling her. There wasn't a simple explanation. There rarely was once you'd learned to stop hoping for one. She reported it immediately. Stood in the yard with Nate as Silas arrived, hat pushed back, face arranged into something that might have passed, to anyone who hadn't spent 2 weeks learning his tells, for genuine concern. $40, Silas said. That's a lot to go missing. Quiet. I counted it last night, Suyin said. It was there, was it? Silas let that sit a beat too long. Funny thing. Found this in the barn this morning. He held out a folded slip of paper. A receipt. Her handwriting on it, except it wasn't her handwriting. Not quite. Close enough to pass a careless glance, but wrong in the slant of the letters, Wrong in a way only someone who'd spent a lifetime reading her own hand would ever catch. Nate took it. Read it slow. His jaw tightened the way it had that first evening over the feed contracts, except this time the tightness was aimed somewhere new. This is dated last night, he said. Your hand. It isn't, looks like it. Looks isn't is. Her voice came out sharper than she meant it, because something cold had opened up in her chest, fast. The particular chill of watching a door she'd thought was finally open start, very quietly, to swing shut again. Nate, look at the letters, the way the K closes. Mine never closes that tight. He looked. She watched him look, and for one long, terrible second, she watched him not quite decide. I want to believe you, he said. Want isn't the same as do. He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer, and it landed harder than anything Hank Dodd had ever spat into the dirt near her boots. She went back to the office alone that night. Didn't cry. Wouldn't let herself. Not yet. Not until she'd done the one thing that had never once failed her, the work. Because feelings could be argued with, twisted, doubted. Numbers couldn't. Numbers only ever said one thing, and they said it the same way every time you asked. Her hands weren't steady at first. She let them shake through the first few minutes, sitting alone with the lamp, the accusation still ringing in her ears. Want isn't the same as do. She'd said it to him plain, and meant every word, and some small treacherous part of her mind kept circling back anyway, asking whether he'd truly believed her at all, or only decided it was easier not to fight about it in front of Silas. Stop. She made herself stop. Because that kind of thinking led nowhere useful, and she had work to do, and the work, unlike people, had never once let her down when she needed it most. She laid the forged receipt flat under the lamp, studied the ink first. Hers ran thin, always had, a habit from mixing it herself back when store-bought ink cost more than she could spare. This ink sat thick on the page, pooled slightly at the tail of every letter. Different hand, different ink, different pen likely, judging by the width of the strokes. She pulled 3 of her own ledger entries for comparison, set them beside the forgery under the light. The K. Hers opened wide at the base, always had, some habit from her mother's hand passed down without her ever choosing it. This K closed tight, cramped, a stranger's letter wearing her name like a borrowed coat that didn't fit right in the shoulders. And the date. She checked it against her own memory first, then against the household ledger, then against Otis Kane's feedlog from that same week, because a good case wasn't built on one thread. It was built on 3 that all pulled the same direction. The date on the forgery placed the theft at an hour she could prove, beyond argument. She'd spent standing in the bunkhouse yard, mending Cole's shirt collar in front of 4 other hands, all of whom could vouch for the time if asked plainly enough. By midnight she had it laid out clean, ink letter form, alibi. 3 separate proofs, each one small, each one together, woman, unshakable. She sat back, let herself breathe for the first time in hours, because this was the thing about being doubted that nobody warned you of. It didn't just hurt in the moment. It made you question, briefly, cruelly, whether you'd imagined your own innocence in the first place. She hadn't. She knew that now, certain as arithmetic. But knowing it, and having it doubted by someone whose opinion had started to matter more than it should, those were 2 very different kinds of pain, and she'd just spent an entire night learning the difference. She brought the proof to him at dawn, found him already awake, sitting on the porch step in the gray early light, looking like a man who hadn't slept either. He looked up when her footsteps reached the porch, and something in his face, tired, drawn, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, told her he'd spent the night doing his own kind of arithmetic, the kind that didn't involve ledgers at all. I was wrong, he said, before she'd even sat down. Last night. I should have trusted you outright. You should have. I did trust you. Some part of me knew the second I read that receipt something was off. He turned his hat over once, the old habit. Fear's a poor excuse for doubt. I let myself be afraid of losing more money I couldn't and I let that fear crowd out what I already knew about your character. Fear makes fools of careful men, she said. I've seen it before. Doesn't make it right, no. She sat down beside him, closer than strictly necessary, and let the silence hold a moment before continuing. It doesn't, and I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Standing there, watching you not quite decide. That's its own kind of lonely, Nate. Being doubted by the one person in this whole county who'd finally started to feel safe. I know. His voice roughened. I've been sitting out here most of the night trying to find a way to say that doesn't sound like an excuse. Haven't found one yet. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe you just say sorry plain and mean it and let the next week's prove whether it holds. I can do that. She set the papers in his lap, watched him read through the ink comparison, the letter forms, the alibi laid out clean and undeniable, watched something in his shoulders loosen as the proof did its work, though the tightness in his jaw didn't fully ease. Not even once the doubt was answered, because some part of him, she suspected, was still angry, not at her, at himself for having needed the proof at all, instead of simply believing her the first time. I'll let you know when it's enough. Fair, he said again, softer this time. They sat a moment in the gray light together, the proof of her innocence resting between them, like something they'd built with 4 hands instead of 2, and Suyin thought, not for the first time, that trust rebuilt after a crack was different from trust that had never broken at all. Sturdier, somehow, because now they both knew exactly what it would cost to lose it again. The forgery told her something else too. Something she hadn't let herself say out loud yet, even to Nate, because whoever had faked that receipt hadn't just wanted the missing $40 blamed on somebody. They'd wanted it blamed on her specifically. Her hand copied, however clumsily. Her name signed to a theft she hadn't committed, which meant somebody had studied her handwriting closely enough to imitate it, which meant this wasn't panic. This was planning. She found Silas 2 days later out past the corral, alone, checking a fence line that didn't strictly need checking. She'd come looking for him deliberately, because there was a question sitting in her chest that had been growing heavier by the hour, and she'd decided, somewhere in the last 2 sleepless nights, that she'd rather ask it to his face than keep carrying it silent. You picked me, she said. No greeting, not another hand, not a mistake in the count you could have blamed on carelessness. Me. Specifically. Silas didn't look up from the fence post he was testing. Don't know what you mean, you do. She kept her voice level, though her pulse was climbing. Any of a dozen hands could have been blamed for missing cash. You built a forgery. Studied my hand close enough to fake it. That takes effort most men wouldn't spend on a careless mistake. He straightened slowly, looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite guilt, closer to a kind of tired, ugly honesty, the look of a man who'd stopped bothering to hide behind politeness because he no longer saw the point. You want the truth, he said. Fine. You were the easiest one to blame. A Chinese widow with no family in this state, no husband to speak for her, no friends in town who'd stand up and swear her character. Boss hires a woman like Hank's daddy fought on the rail lines. Half this county already halfway convinced her kind can't be trusted. With $1. I didn't have to work hard to make it stick. Just had to point and let this whole county's opinion do the rest of the work for me. The words landed like a slap. Not because they surprised her, she'd known, on some level, since the first shut door in Copper Creek, exactly what kind of calculation men like Silas made about a woman like her. But hearing it said plain, cold, without even the decency of shame attached to it, was its own kind of wound entirely. You didn't hate me, she said slowly. You just decided I was convenient. Same thing most days. Comes out the same in the end. It isn't the same. Her voice shook now, not with fear, with something closer to fury, banked low and controlled, the kind that burns longer than the loud kind ever does. Hatred at least admits I'm a person worth hating. What you did was worse. You looked at me and saw nothing at all. A shape convenient for blame. Believe whatever helps you sleep, Silas said. Doesn't change what's true. This state was built by men deciding whose word counted and whose didn't, long before either of us got here. I just knew which side of that line you'd been drawn on the second you stepped off that wagon. Then you've badly misjudged which side I intend to stay on. Something flickered across his face, not fear exactly, but the first faint edge of it, the recognition, however grudging, that the woman standing in front of him wasn't behaving the way his calculations had promised she would. He didn't answer that. Just turned back to the fence post, like the conversation had already cost him more attention than he cared to keep spending on it. She walked away with her hands trembling and her mind very clear, and understood, moved, for the first time with total certainty, that this wasn't only about stolen feed money anymore. It never had been. Not really. She didn't tell Nate the whole of that conversation right away. Some things needed time to settle into words that wouldn't come out as raw as they felt. She rode into Copper Creek 2 days later for supplies, alone, because Otis had a lame horse to see to and there wasn't anyone else free to spare the time. She told herself the ride would clear her head. It didn't Carnival. Not entirely, because the town hadn't changed much in the weeks since her first walk down its main street, and neither, but she discovered quickly, had its opinion of her. The general store clerk who'd once told her the position was filled that morning greeted her now with the stiff polite, the kind reserved for someone whose employer's name carried more weight than her own ever would. He served her. He didn't meet her eyes doing it. She passed the boarding house on her way to the feed store, the same no vacancy card still turned to the glass, and found Pawnawind, to her own quiet surprise, that it no longer stung the way it once had, not because the town had softened, because she'd stopped needing its approval quite so badly as she once had, back when $3 in a carpet bag had been the whole of what stood between her and the road. Outside, near the assay office where she'd once stood with nowhere left to go, she overheard two women talking, not troubling themselves to lower their voices, the way people rarely do when they've already decided the subject of their conversation doesn't fully count as a person capable of hearing them. Heard the Hargrove foreman's been having trouble with that Chinese woman he took in. Wouldn't surprise me. You let one of them get comfortable, they take advantage soon enough. Soon didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply finished loading her purchases into the saddlebag, hands steady through long practice, at appearing steadier than she felt, and rode back out of town with the words trailing after her, the whole 4 miles home like smoke that wouldn't quite clear. It confirmed what Silas had already told her plainly enough. If it ever came to her word against his, this county's sympathies wouldn't need much persuading which way to lean. She wasn't just fighting a dishonest foreman. She was fighting an entire town's willingness to believe the worst of her before she'd said a single word in her own defense. She thought of Wen briefly, and the company office that had never once considered her claim on his back pay worth a serious hearing. Different state. Same arithmetic. She rode the rest of the way home with her jaw set, and her resolve, if anything, sharper for the reminder of exactly what she was up against. Because there was still the matter of the old page, 4 years deep, that she'd been carrying alone since the night she first found it. She pulled it out that evening, set it beside the newer forgery, beside the pattern of 6 years of careful theft, and looked at the whole shape of it, laid out together for the first time. Not scattered mistakes anymore. A single continuous hand, patient, unhurried, stealing a little here and a little there for 6 long years from a man too busy grieving, too busy building, too trusting of the people around him to ever look closely enough to catch it. And she thought, unbidden, of another set of numbers, another ledger, 1,000 miles east, where a rail company had done the exact same arithmetic to her own husband. Wages owed, never paid. A widow's claim dismissed as somebody else's problem to solve, in some other office, in some other city, where nobody would ever have to look her in the eye and say the money simply wasn't coming. She remembered standing in that company office in Reno 6 weeks for her voice steady, even though nothing else in her had been. The clerk hadn't even looked up from his own ledger, while he told her the matter would need to go through San Francisco. We hadn't offered her a chair, hadn't offered her anything at all, except the thin, practiced patience men extend to a problem they've already decided will eventually just go away on its own, once the person attached to it runs out of money, or will, or both. She hadn't run out of will. She'd run out of money first, and the two, she was learning, weren't nearly as connected as that clerk had clearly assumed they'd be. Different men, different reasons maybe on the surface of it, except underneath, it was the same cold calculation, over and over, in every ledger she'd ever opened since Wen died. Take from the people least likely to be believed if they complained. Count on silence being cheaper to buy than honesty. Count on grief making a person too tired to fight, or too poor, or too foreign, or too female, or simply too alone. She sat with that a long while. Because it wasn't a coincidence, not exactly, not in the sense of two unrelated accidents colliding by chance. It was a pattern repeating itself across an entire state, an entire country maybe, wherever men decided some lives were worth less arithmetic than others. She hadn't been able to stop it happening to Wen. She hadn't been fast enough, hadn't had the standing, hadn't had anyone in that company office willing to listen to a widow's careful accounting, instead of dismissing it outright. She could stop it happening here. She had the standing now. She had a man beside her willing to listen, finally, fully, without flinching from what the truth might cost him. She wasn't going to waste it. She sat a long while longer, with both ledgers open in front of her, the old and the new, 6 years apart and 1,000 miles apart, and somehow, underneath it all, exactly the same story told twice. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that some small part of the grief she'd carried since Reno had shifted, just slightly, into something that felt less like helplessness and more like purpose. Wen had never gotten his justice. She hadn't been able to give it to him, not then, not with $3 and a company office that wouldn't even offer her a chair. She could give somebody else's justice now. It wasn't the same as his, it would never be the same as his. But it was something, and something, but after 6 weeks of nothing, felt like more than she dared to hope for. She found Nate at the corral fence at dusk, watching the same young horse he'd been gentling all summer, saddle sitting easy on its back now, no complaint left in the animal at all. "I need to show you something," she said, the old ledger from 4 years back. Something in his face went still, like he already sensed before she'd said another word that whatever was coming would cost him something he hadn't finished grieving yet. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough I waited 2 weeks to be certain before bringing it to you." She held the book out, didn't soften the moment with anything but honesty, because he deserved that much, and because softening it now would only make the truth heavier when it finally landed. "It's about the fever, about what it cost you, and about who let you pay for it twice." He took the ledger with hands that weren't quite steady, opened it to the page she'd marked, and read it slowly, once, then again, as though a second reading might change what the first had already told him. She watched his face while he read, watched the color leave it by degrees. Quiet. Almost too quiet to hear, over the evening wind moving through the corral rails. "Same week. Same amount. Near enough. I've checked it 3 ways. Ink, timing, the supplier's own posted rates against what was billed twice." She kept her voice steady, the way she'd learned to keep it steady, delivering hard truths in a rail camp full of men who didn't want to hear them. "I'm certain, Nate, as certain as I've been of anything since I opened these books." He closed the ledger, didn't hand it back, just stood there a long moment, staring past it toward the horizon, where the last color was draining slow out of the sky. She was upstairs, he said, dying, and somewhere in this house, a man was doing arithmetic on it, figuring how much he could skim off the top of what it cost to try and save her. I don't know that he thought of it that coldly. Doesn't matter how he thought of it. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and he cleared his throat hard, like a man determined not to let grief win the argument in front of her. "Matters what he did. Matters that I paid for her medicine twice and never once knew it, and spent 4 years grieving a woman I couldn't save while the man responsible sat at my table every evening asking after my health. I'm sorry," she said. "I wish I'd found nothing. I wish there'd been nothing here to find." "No." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before, not even the night he'd told her about the hairpin in the tin. "Don't be sorry for finding the truth. Be sorry it took a stranger riding 400 miles to be the first person willing to actually look for it. Everybody else in this county just let me grieve and never once thought to check whether the grieving had been made worse on purpose." He set the ledger down carefully on the top rail of the fence, like it had gotten heavier in his hands' size should have allowed, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The young horse shifted in the pen behind him, tossed its head once at some sound in the brush, and settled again. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. "I want to walk into that barn right now and put my fist through his teeth." He said it flat, no heat rising with the words, which somehow made it more believable than if he'd shouted it. "I won't. Wouldn't prove anything a court needs, and I'd rather see him ruined proper than satisfy myself for 5 minutes and hand him a reason to call it self-defense. Then we build the case," she said. "All of it. Every year, every entry laid out so plain no sheriff in this county could look away from it. Together. Together." She held his gaze steady. "But you should know. Silas as good as told me himself 2 days back exactly why he chose me to frame for that missing money. Told me plainly this county would believe him over me without needing much convincing. If we take this to town, it won't just be numbers on trial. It'll be whether anyone here is willing to believe a widow like me over a foreman they've known for years." Something hardened in his jaw. Not doubt this time. Resolve. Then we make sure the numbers do the convincing, he said, since apparently this county can't be trusted to do it on its own account. He took the ledger back, tucked it inside his coat, the same pocket where he kept every other piece of proof that mattered, close against his chest, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Copper Creek, Suyin let herself believe fully that the man standing beside her intended to fight for the truth as hard as she did. The days that followed moved faster than any since her arrival. They worked the ledgers together most evenings now, no pretense left about reasons or excuses, just the two of them at the desk with the lamp burning steady, building the case entry by entry until it stood tall for any man's word to knock back down. Nate rode into town twice that week, quiet trips he didn't explain in detail, and came back both times with folded papers tucked inside his coat, alongside the ledger's copies pulled from the feed store's own posted prices, a supplier's delivery log, small pieces of outside proof that would matter. Suyin knew, once this stopped being a private matter between a rancher and his foreman and became something a sheriff would need convincing of. Otis Kane offered what he could too, in his own quiet way. A remembered date here, a wagon he'd seen arrive short of what was paid for there, small threads that wouldn't have meant much on their own, but tightened the weave considerably, once laid alongside everything else. Even Cole, still red-eared and awkward around her most days, came to the office one evening, with a torn scrap of paper he'd found stuffed behind a loose board in the bunkhouse, an old note in Silas's hand, careless, half a sentence, about a payment that never should have existed at all. He set it on the desk without a word, and left before she could thank him properly. By the end of the week, Suyin had it, the whole shape of 6 years, laid out clean across more pages than she'd ever wanted to fill for a reason like this one. It's enough, Clancy numb, she told Nate, late one night, the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder over the final tally. More than enough. No honest sheriff could look at this and call it a misunderstanding. Then we take it to town, not yet. She held his gaze. Silas already knows we're close. A cornered man doesn't wait quietly to be caught. We go in prepared for that, or we don't go in at all. He nodded slowly. Understanding, she thought, you would. Exactly what she meant, even before either of them could yet guess how right she'd turn out to be. They sat a while longer. After that, neither quite ready to end the evening, the lamp burning low and the case laid out, finished between them like something they'd built together brick by careful brick. Can I ask you something? Nate said. Not about the ledgers. You can ask. Do you ever regret it? Stepping off that wagon here instead of somewhere else? He wasn't looking at her when he said it, busy folding a corner of paper that didn't need folding, the particular fidgeting of a man working up to a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Could have been any town, any rancher on any street corner. Instead, it was me. She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. Some nights, she admitted. The nights this ranch feels harder than staying in Reno would have been. Those nights. Yes, I wonder. She turned her teacup slow between her hands. Most nights, though. No. Most nights I think about the 6 doors that shut in my face, and I think, what if even one of them had opened instead? I'd never have been standing outside that assay office at all. Never have heard a horse come down the street at an easy trot. That a kind way of saying you're glad they shut. It's a complicated way of saying it, she said. Grief doesn't leave room for simple answers most days. But no, I'm not glad they shut. I'm glad, in spite of it, of where I ended up standing after. Something eased in his face, gentle and unguarded, the look of a man hearing something he'd hoped for without quite letting himself expect it. I used to think this ranch was the only thing keeping me upright, he said. After the fever. Work, mostly. Cattle don't ask you how you're holding up. Land doesn't either. He glanced at her, something careful and searching in it. Lately, I've been thinking it isn't just the work anymore. She didn't answer right away, let the silence hold, warm and unhurried, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Lately, she said finally, I've noticed that, too. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them. Not yet. Some things, she understood, deserved to be built slowly, the way trust had been rebuilt after the forged receipt not rushed toward, but earned, evening by careful evening, until the reaching for it felt less like a risk and more like the next honest step in a conversation already well underway. He reached over instead and covered her hand with his briefly, warm and steady against the desk between them, and neither of them said anything more about it. They didn't need to. Later, after he'd gone, she took the folded letter from the drawer where she kept it, the paper gone even softer now at its creases than when she'd first carried it out of Reno. She didn't read it. She'd read it enough times to know every word by heart, and some evenings, lately, it was enough simply to hold it a moment, feel the weight of it in her palm, before setting it carefully away again. She thought of the silver hairpin sitting in its tin on Nate's dresser, one floor up, and understood, moved with a clarity that startled her slightly, that they'd each spent 4 years keeping their grief in a drawer, small and private, waiting for someone willing to sit with them long enough to understand why a single ordinary object could hold an entire life's worth of losing inside it. She didn't know yet what came next for either of them. Once this business with Silas was finally one way or another, she knew only that for the first time since a hillside outside Reno had taken everything from her, she wanted to find out. Behind them, unseen, in the days that followed, Silas Crane grew quieter, watchful, the easy, agreeable mask he'd worn for 6 comfortable years slipping, bit by bit, into something harder underneath. He found Hank Dodd alone in the barn one evening, currying a horse with more force than the animal strictly required, and stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking. "They're building something," Silas said. "Her and the boss. Every evening that lamp burning past me." "Ain't my problem," Hank said. "Boss already warned me off once. I'm not looking to lose my wage twice over. Wouldn't ask you to." Silas's voice stayed level, almost pleasant, the tone of a man discussing weather rather than ruin. "Just asking you to remember whose payroll you were on before hers ever started. 6 years, Hank. I've covered for men in this bunkhouse more than once. Man remembers who covers for him when the time comes to return the favor." Hank set the curry comb down slow, studied Silas a long moment, something calculating behind his own eyes now, the particular look of a man weighing exactly how much loyalty a debt like that was worth against the risk of losing everything alongside it. "What exactly you asking me to do?" "Nothing yet." Silas's mouth curved, thin and humorless, into something that might have passed for a smile in poorer light. "Just asking you to be ready when the time comes." He left Hank standing there with the question hanging unanswered in the dark, and walked back out into the yard alone, already turning over, with the patient, unhurried calculation of a man who'd gotten away with far worse for far longer, exactly what shape his last stand was going to take. He stopped at the edge of the yard, looked back once toward the main house, where the office window still burned steady in the dark, the way it had burned steady every night for weeks now, patient and unrelenting as the woman who kept it lit. 6 years, he thought. 6 years of careful, quiet arithmetic, undone in a matter of weeks by a widow with nothing but a carpet bag and a mind for numbers he'd badly underestimated. He wasn't a man who lost easily. He'd built his whole life, such as it was, on being the one who calculated the angles other people missed. That skill hadn't left him, just because the tide had finally turned against him. It had simply changed what it was calculating for, because a cornered man doesn't simply wait to be caught. He starts planning his way out, and some men, when the walls finally close in around them, stop caring how much wreckage they leave behind on their way through. The morning they rode into Copper Creek, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of gray that couldn't decide whether it meant to rain or simply threaten it all day out of spite. Suyin sat the wagon seat with the ledgers boxed at her feet, 6 years of careful proof stacked and tied with twine, and felt her pulse climbing steady with every mile that brought the town closer, because this was the moment. The one she'd been building toward since a cramped office and a dusty shelf and a column of numbers that leaned one direction only, except knowing a moment is coming and being ready for it, turned out to be 2 very different things. She'd barely slept, had lain awake most of the night running through every argument Silas might raise, every excuse he might reach for, every way this could still go sideways despite 3 weeks of careful preparation, because that was the trouble with proof, even good proof. Even proof as clean as anything she'd ever assembled. It only worked if people were willing to look at it honestly. "Stop," she told herself. "You've done the work. Let the work speak." Except the work had never had to speak in front of a rifle before. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead until just now, jolting along in a wagon with the town's rooftops just starting to show above the sage flats, and the thought landed cold and unwelcome in her stomach. She'd learned in these months in Nevada exactly how selective honesty could get when it came to whose word counted. Nate rode alongside the wagon, quiet, jaw set the way it got whenever he'd already decided something and didn't need to say it out loud twice. Otis drove. Cole rode behind, along for reasons nobody had quite explained, except she suspected he simply hadn't wanted to be left out of whatever was about to happen. "You're certain about this," Nate said, not for the first time that morning. "I'm certain about the numbers." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I'm less certain about the town. Town'll believe what the proof makes them believe. Towns don't always work that way. You know that as well as I do." He didn't argue the point, because he couldn't, not honestly, not after everything Silas had told her plain out by that fence line. If it ever came to her word against his, this county's sympathies wouldn't need much persuading which way to lean. She thought of Wen's letter, folded soft in her coat pocket where she'd tucked it that morning without quite deciding to. Some part of her had wanted him along, in whatever small way a folded piece of paper could manage it, because if today went badly, she wanted something of his close by to remind her why she'd started this in the first place. And if today went well, she wanted him there for that too. Some victories only felt whole if you had someone to share them with, even someone who could no longer answer back. The town came into view. Same dusty street, same tin awnings, same boardwalk where 6 doors had shut in her face a lifetime ago, though it had only been a handful of weeks. It looked smaller now. She wasn't sure if that meant she'd changed, or the town had, or if it was simply easier to see a place clearly once you'd stopped needing its approval quite so badly. The general store was crowded when they walked in. A Saturday, supplies day, half the county's ranch hands and their wives, crammed between the shelves and the counter, which was exactly what Nate had planned for. Witnesses, he'd said the night before. Plenty of them. A man can talk his way around a sheriff alone in a back room. Can't talk his way around a room full of his own neighbors watching him do it. He laid the ledgers out on the counter, one by one, 6 months of records cross-checked against the feed store's own posted prices, showing plain as daylight that Silas Crane had been billing the Hargrove Ranch for grain at nearly twice the going rate, pocketing the difference through a supplier's name that traced back, every time, to nobody at all. The room went quiet by degrees, the quiet of people realizing, all at once, that something serious was happening in front of them, and none of them had been expecting to witness it over a simple errand for flour and nails. A woman near the flour barrels leaned toward her husband and whispered something Suan didn't catch. He shushed her, but he was leaning in too, craning to see the pages spread across the counter. Silas arrived 20 minutes later, called for, though he didn't know that yet, by a boy Nate had sent riding ahead with a message about urgent ranch business needing his signature. He walked in easy, confident, the mask still fully in place, until he saw the ledgers spread across the counter, until he saw Suyan standing beside them, steady, unflinching, 6 years of his careful theft laid out in her own handwriting for the whole town to read. "What is this?" he said, voice still level. "Barely, you know exactly what it is." Nate's voice carried across the room, calm, deliberate, fervent, pitched to be heard by everyone crowded against the shelves. 6 years of feed contracts billed through a cousin who doesn't exist. I checked with the clerk myself. Nobody in this county's ever heard the name. That's a misunderstanding. It isn't. Suyan stepped forward, kept her voice steady, though her heart was slamming hard enough she could feel it in her throat. "I checked the ink, the dates, the supplier's own delivery book against every receipt you filed. None of it matches. None of it was ever meant to. You'd take a bookkeeper's word over 6 years of honest service. It isn't her word." Nate, again sharper now. "It's arithmetic. Arithmetic doesn't care whose word anybody's inclined to take." Silas's eyes swept the room, searching for allies, for the sympathy he'd been so certain, weeks ago, this county would hand him without a fight. "Some of you know me," he said, louder now, playing to the room. "Known me years. Known her what, a few weeks. A stranger. A woman who found the truth in your own handwriting." Nate cut in. "Whatever else you want to say about her, that part isn't in question." Somebody near the back of the store, an older rancher Suyan didn't recognize, muttered something low to the woman beside him, and she caught just enough of it to understand the tide. In the room had already started quietly, decisively, to turn. "Show us the cousin Silas," the rancher said, louder now, no longer muttering. "Real simple. Bring the man in here, let him speak for himself." Silas didn't answer that. Couldn't. because there wasn't any answer that wouldn't finish unraveling what little was left of the story he'd been telling this town for 6 years. He saw it, too. Saw the whole room turning, felt it the way a man feels weather changing before the first drop falls, and something in his face shifted from confidence into something far more desperate. That was when he grabbed the rifle off the rack by the counter. Wild-eyed. Desperate in a way that made him more dangerous, not less. The particular danger of a man who'd already lost everything he'd built his life around and had nothing left to calculate for except how much he could take down with him. The room erupted into motion. A woman screamed somewhere near the flour barrels. Someone knocked a display of tins, clattering to the floor, scrambling backward, and for one suspended moment the whole store seemed to hold its breath at once, every eye fixed on the black length of iron in Silas's shaking hands. "No woman's arithmetic," he said, voice cracking now, "is going to cost me 6 years." Nate moved without a word. Stepped between the rifle and the room, and for one endless second, Suyin felt the whole world narrow down to the black circle of that barrel, and the man standing in front of her who intended plainly to take whatever came next in her place. Because she'd seen this before. Not this exact moment, never this exact moment, but the shape of it. A man she loved standing between herself and something that could kill him, and her own body frozen half a step too far away to do anything about it. Except this time she wasn't frozen. This time her feet were already moving before her mind had caught up to give the order. She thought, in that one shattering second, of a hillside outside Reno, a blast that came too close, a foreman who'd told her, not unkindly, that a widow's claim was somebody else's problem now. She thought, not again. Not him too. Not while I'm standing close enough to do something about it. It wasn't Nate who ended it. It was Suyin herself, stepping forward before she'd had time to be afraid of doing it, snatching a heavy bolt of canvas off the dry goods shelf beside her and swinging it hard, full weight behind it, into the back of Silas's knees. He buckled. The rifle swung wide as he went down, firing once into the ceiling in a burst of noise that sent half the store diving for cover, plaster raining down in a fine white cloud that settled slow over the scattered flour sacks and the dropped canvas and the sudden ringing silence that followed. For one heartbeat, nobody moved at all. The echo of the shot seemed to hang in the rafters, refusing to fully fade. The sheriff, who'd been standing near the door the whole time, quiet witness to everything that had unfolded, had the weapon out of Silas's hands and the irons on his wrists inside of 10 seconds, moving faster than his usual unhurried gait had suggested he was capable of. The whole store stood frozen a moment longer, long enough to hear the dust finish settling, long enough for the woman who'd screamed to start, quietly, crying with relief instead, her husband's arm gone tight around her shoulders. Nate turned to her. Something in his face that wasn't gratitude alone. Something closer to seeing her clearly, fully, for the first time, though he'd claimed weeks ago to have seen her clearly from the very start. "Where in the world," he said, voice unsteady, "did you learn to swing a bolt of canvas like that?" 6 years married to a man who worked rail crews, she said, her own hands shaking now, worse than the day by the spring house, though she kept her voice even through sheer force of will. "You learn to move fast, or you get left behind at every camp. I did not plan that. Good thing you didn't." Something rough and unpracticed in his voice, half laugh, half something closer to relief too large to hold steady. Man who plans a rescue usually gets there a beat too late. He reached for her hand, checked her over the way he had the day. The heifer nearly ran her down, careful fingers finding no injury, and still not quite convinced enough to fully let go. "You're not hurt, no." Her voice caught, just slightly. "You." "No." He looked down at her hand, still held in his, seemed to notice for the first time he hadn't released it, and didn't move to correct that either. "Scared half to death. Not hurt." Around them, the store was slowly coming back to life. Murmurs rising, someone riding the toppled tin display, the sheriff hauling Silas up off the floor with the grip that suggested he didn't much care whether the process was gentle. It was there, patting Silas down before the walk to the jail, that a folded packet of papers fell loose from an inner coat pocket. Yellowed. Old. Older than anything else on this ranch's books by years. Suyin knelt without quite deciding to. Picked it up before the sheriff could sweep it aside with everything else, because something about the handwriting on the topmost page had gone through her like a struck bell. Not Silas's hand. A different one. Older ink, faded near to brown, the particular blue-black of company ledgers she'd spent 6 years learning to read by candlelight, in a rented room, going through a dead man's affairs one column at a time. She unfolded it with hands that had gone suddenly, completely still. The whole store seemed to fall away around her. The murmuring crowd, the sheriff's grip on Silas's arm, all of it narrowing down to the single page, trembling slightly between her fingers. A rail company's wage ledger. A name near the bottom of a long column of names, most crossed through with dates of payment beside them. Wen Quan. Uncrossed. No date. No payment ever recorded against it. Her breath left her all at once. Nate. Her voice came out, smaller than she meant it to. This is a company ledger. From the rail line. From Reno. He came to her side, read over her shoulder, his own breath catching audibly when he reached the name. How does Silas have this? She turned the page. Found, tucked behind it, a second sheet, a bill of sale, of all things, for a batch of fresh accident and payroll records, sold quietly by a company clerk, willing to look the other way for a price. Silas's own signature at the bottom, dated only weeks after Wen's accident, a private purchase that had nothing at all to do with the Hargrove Ranch. He's had a man at the rail company feeding him fresh accident records, she said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces even as she spoke it aloud. Looking for exactly this kind of thing. Unpaid wages, uncollected debts, names nobody was left to chase down while the grief was still too raw to fight. Her hands were trembling now, not with fear, with something closer to fury circling fast into disbelief. He wasn't only stealing from you, Nate. The same week he bought this ledger, my husband hadn't even been in the ground a full month yet. Buying dead men's debts before the dirt's even settled, Nate said, grim, and collecting on them himself under names that don't exist. Same as he did here. Silas, still in the sheriff's grip, said nothing. Didn't deny it. Didn't have the strength left, apparently, for one more lie. She stared at Wen's name on the page, uncrossed, unpaid. Sitting patient in a stranger's stolen ledger all this time, waiting, she understood now with a clarity that nearly buckled her knees the way the canvas bolt had buckled Silas's, for someone to finally come looking. She had come looking. She just hadn't known, riding into this town for entirely different reasons, that the search would lead here. This proves it, she said, barely above a whisper. Proves the company never intended to pay him. Proves it was never a misunderstanding waiting on San Francisco. It was exactly what you found in your own ledgers, Nate. The same arithmetic, the same cold calculation, played out on a bigger stage. The sheriff, listening now with real interest, stepped closer. Ma'am, if that ledger shows what I think it shows, that's evidence enough to reopen a wage claim clean through state court. Company can't argue against its own book. You're certain. Certain as anything I've seen in 20 years wearing this badge. He nodded toward the page. That's their own hand, their own column. No judge in this state's going to look at that and call it a widow's imagination. Suyin held the page against her chest a long moment. 6 weeks of carrying grief like a debt nobody would ever agree to settle, and here it was, finally, proof in black ink that Wen had been owed exactly what he'd asked for so politely in a letter he never sent. She thought of him, briefly, clearly, the way she hadn't quite let herself in weeks. Measure twice, cut never, if you can help it. She'd measured longer than twice, and the cutting finally was about to happen on terms that were fair. They rode home slower than they'd ridden in, the ledgers empty now in the wagon bed, the whole business of the morning settling that felt less like victory and more like the bone-deep exhaustion that follows a fight finally won. You didn't tell me you were carrying the letter, Nate said. Somewhere along the road, nodding toward the pocket where she'd tucked it that morning. I didn't tell myself either. Not really. Just found my hand reaching for it before I'd decided. Why? Glad you did, so am I. She looked out over the sage flats, gold now under a sky that had finally lit against rain after all. Feels strange. 6 weeks of carrying that letter like it was the only proof he'd ever existed. And now there's a company ledger with his name in it too. Proof from somewhere I never expected to find any. Doesn't make the letter matter less. No. She managed something close to a smile. Just means he isn't only mine to remember anymore. The whole county's going to know his name now, whether they meant to learn it or not. Nate didn't answer that directly. Just rode a while in companionable quiet beside the wagon and reached over once, briefly, to rest a hand over hers where it sat folded in her lap. The same gesture from the office desk weeks before, warm and steady, and asking nothing more of her than to simply be received. She received it, and let herself finally exhale the whole weight of the morning out into the wide gold evening settling over the road home. 3 months passed. Silas Crane sat in the county jail awaiting trial for fraud, his invented supplier exposed as worthless, his private trade in dead men's unpaid wages unraveling into charges the sheriff assured them would keep him well occupied for considerably longer than 6 years. The Hargrove Ranch ran its accounts at honest prices for the first time in longer than anyone, but Suyen's own careful ledgers could fully measure. Hank Dodd hadn't come back to work. Word reached the ranch, secondhand, that he'd drifted 2 counties over. Still muttering, Otis reported dryly about widows and arithmetic to anyone fool enough to buy him a drink and listen. 2 of the other hands who'd blocked her path that day had, to her genuine surprise, sought her out separately to apologize, awkward and stiff-necked about it, the way men are when they've been made to see something plainly that they'd have preferred to leave blurred. She accepted both apologies without making either man grovel for it. There was no profit in that, and she'd never much cared for profit that came at someone else's expense. The bunkhouse mending pile had shrunk to almost nothing, not because the men needed fewer clothes, because half of them had started bringing her their shirts with an easy nod instead of the weary distance of her first weeks, as if the fight in the general store had settled some question in the ranch's collective mind that no amount of honest bookkeeping alone could have settled on its own. Copper Creek had changed its mind about a number of things, the way towns do once the story that matters most to them shifts from what a person is to what a person has done. The general store extended the Hargrove account fair credit again. The clerk who'd once told her the position was filled, that morning now greeted her by name, and meant it. And once, unprompted, set aside a bolt of good blue cloth he thought she might favor for mending, an odd small kindness that struck her. When it happened, she harder than she expected it to. Not every door had opened. She wasn't foolish enough to believe a few months of scandal had cured a whole county of habits built over decades. The 2 women outside the assay office still crossed the street some mornings rather than pass her directly. A few ranchers further out still spoke her name with a careful hesitation that told her exactly what they were choosing not to say. But enough doors had opened, and opened honestly, that she'd stopped counting the shut ones quite so carefully as she once had. One afternoon in August, riding into town for supplies, she passed the boarding house where a card had once read no vacancy in a window that lied as plainly as anyone had ever lied to her. The landlady was out front, sweeping the step, and looked up as Suyen passed. Mrs. Quan. A nod stiff, but not unkind. Heard what you did for the Hargrove place. Whole county's talking about it. Some of it kindly, I hope, more than you'd think. The woman set the broom aside. For what it's worth. If you'd come through that door today instead of that first week, I expect you'd have found the vacancy real. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was closer to honesty than the woman had offered her the first time, and Suyen found she could accept it in the spirit it was given, without needing it dressed up as anything grander than it was. I appreciate you saying so, she said and meant it, and rode on toward the general store without looking back, because there was no need anymore to wonder what expression might be watching her go. The wage claim arrived by post on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before that September evening at the corral. A modest sum, nothing that would make her rich, but more than she'd ever expected to see again after a company clerk in Reno had told her, without troubling to look up from his own ledger, that the matter would need to go through San Francisco. She'd sat with the envelope a long while before opening it. Sat longer still after. The settlement inside, laid out plain on the kitchen table, official and undeniable, months of grief, finally given the dignity of an honest number. She hadn't cried over Wen's death in months. She cried a little that afternoon, quiet and unhurried, not from sorrow exactly, but from the plain relief of watching an old wound finally fully close. Wen's unsent letter sat now in a small wooden box on the office shelf, beside the settled ledgers, no longer the only thing she had left to prove a life had mattered. She found Nate at the corral fence on an evening in late September. The same young horse from her first morning on the ranch, gentled now fully, taking a saddle without complaint, tossing its head once at the fence rail before settling, calm, into the last gold light of the day. She stood a moment before he noticed her. Watching him work, he did the easy patience in his hands as he checked the cinch, the low murmur of his voice to the horse that she'd come, over these months, to recognize as the same steadiness he offered everyone under his care, herself included. "You did that," she said finally, stepping up beside him, nodding at the horse. "3 months of patience. Some things can't be rushed." He didn't look away from the corral, though something in his voice shifted, warmer, softer at the edges. "You push a green horse too hard too early. You get a horse that never trusts a hand again. Is that so?" "It is." He turned to face her fully then, hat off, sun low enough to gild the dust in the yard gold, the same gold it had been the very first afternoon she'd stepped off a freight wagon with $3 and nowhere left to go. "I told you once I wasn't hiring, and then I told you I was asking. I've got another question along those same lines. If you'll let me put it too plain the way I put the first one." She felt her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. "Ask it. I'm not looking for a bookkeeper anymore." He held her gaze steady. "The books are settled. The ranch is honest. Silas Crane isn't coming within 100 miles of my feed contracts again, or anyone else's wages for a long while yet." A breath. "What I'm asking now has nothing to do with any of that." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd stay on this ranch as my wife, not my hired help." He didn't look away, didn't soften it with anything but plain honesty. The same honesty he'd offered her that very first afternoon outside the feed store. "I know what this town will say about it. Some of it ugly still, even after everything. I can't promise you it's upset saying it's, but I can promise you a door that never shuts. Same as I promised the first day." Something rough entered his voice, unguarded, the sound of a man laying down every careful defense he'd built since a fever. "Took everything from him 4 years back. And I find I want to promise you a good deal more than that. Besides." She was quiet a moment, not from hesitation, but because the moment felt too large to rush past without giving it its full weight. She thought of the $3 she'd carried into Copper Creek, and the 6 refusals before a horse came down the street at an easy trot, and the ledger pages that had uncovered a thief, and the bolt of canvas that had saved a man's life, and the stolen company book that had finally, after so many months of carrying it alone, given her husband's death the dignity of being counted honestly. She thought of a copper wire ring sewn into the lining of a carpet bag, and a silver hairpin resting in a tin on a dresser upstairs. 2 small useless necessary things that had taught her, without either of them fully meaning to, exactly what it looked like to keep grief and hope in the very same drawer. She thought, too, of when not with the raw ache of that first week in Copper Creek, but with something gentler now, something closer to gratitude for the years he'd given her, and a quiet certainty that he'd have liked this man standing in front of her, would have argued with him about ledger columns. Probably, and lost every argument on purpose, the way he always did with people he respected. And she found that the answer had been settling in her for weeks, without her fully admitting it to herself. "Yes," she said, too steady now, though her heart wasn't. "I will stay." Something broke open in his face, relief and joy tangled together so plainly, she nearly laughed at how little he'd managed to hide it. For a man who'd spent 4 years learning to hide everything, he didn't kiss her in the middle of the corral yard, not with 2 ranch hands still working the far fence line, both of them, very deliberately, not looking their way, and very obviously listening anyway. But he took her hand in both of his, careful, the way he'd been careful with it the very first day on the boardwalk, and held it like something he didn't intend to let go of again. "This town's going to talk," he said quietly. "Whatever we do, let it talk." She found she meant it fully, the words landing steady and unafraid. "I've spent months learning. I don't need this town's permission to be exactly who I already am. I don't intend to start asking for it now." "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose you do." Word spread through the ranch before supper, the way word always did. Otis Kane was the first to find them still standing at the fence, his weathered face, doing something that might, on a less careful man, have passed for a full smile. "'Bout time," he said, which was as close to sentiment as she'd ever heard from him. Whole bunkhouse had a wager going on how long it'd take him to work up the nerve. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kwan. Ranch is glad to have you staying on proper." Behind them, the young horse tossed its head once more at the fence rail and settled fully into the quiet, as if it too understood. Something had just been decided that wouldn't be undone. That night, after the house had gone quiet and the last of the well-wishing had faded from the porch, she sat alone in the office a while, with the small wooden box down from its shelf, Wen's letter resting inside beside the settled ledgers, and the modest sum that had finally, after so long a silence, answered the question he'd asked so politely and never gotten to send. She unfolded the letter one last time. Read it through, slow, the way she had 100 times before, though this time the ache underneath the words had softened into something closer to tenderness than grief. I found it, she said quietly, to the empty room, to a man who couldn't hear her, and to some part of herself that needed to say it aloud regardless. The answer they never gave you. Found it, and made them pay it, and it took a whole county changing its mind about a great many things besides. She thought he'd have been proud of that. Not surprised. Exactly, he'd always said she had more stubbornness in her than any 6 men he'd worked rail crews beside, but proud. The quiet pride of a man watching someone he loved become exactly who he'd always suspected she could be, given the chance. She folded the letter back along its familiar crease and set it back in the box. Beside the ledger and the settlement, 3 small pieces of a life that had ended too soon, arranged now with the dignity they'd always deserved. Upstairs, she knew, a silver hairpin sat in its small tin, waiting for a similar piece to finally settle over the grief attached to it. That piece, she suspected, watching the candle burn low over the desk where she'd spent so many long evenings chasing the truth through 6 years of careful lies, was already well underway. The late light lay long and gold across the yard, over the office where her ledgers sat balanced and honest, over the bunkhouse where men now brought her their mending without a second thought, over a ranch that had been quietly, thoroughly remade by the same steady hands that had once carried $3 and a dead man's letter into a town that had wanted no part of her at all. She had come to Copper Creek with nothing but a name nobody wanted to say out loud. She was leaving that particular kind of nothing behind for good carrying. Instead, a letter finally answered, a ledger finally balanced, and a door that, for the first time, in longer than she could easily remember, showed no sign at all of ever closing.